The moment I touched the engine, I realized the woman stranded on that dark highway was the girl who once broke my heart. The rain had been falling for nearly an hour, steady and cold, the kind that turned the narrow two-lane highway outside Columbus into a ribbon of shining black glass. Ethan Walker tightened the collar of his worn denim jacket as his old pickup truck rolled past mile marker 32. It was close to midnight, and he had just finished a late repair job at a small farm garage 10 miles back. The headlights cut through the rain until a flash of silver appeared ahead on the shoulder of the road. A sleek luxury car sat crooked with its hazard lights blinking weakly against the storm. Ethan slowed, instinct pulling his foot to the brake. He had spent half his life fixing engines, and something about the quiet desperation of a broken machine on a lonely road always made him stop. He pulled over behind the car and stepped out into the rain, boots splashing into shallow puddles. The driver's side window lowered slowly, revealing a woman gripping the steering wheel, her expression calm but tense. Her dark hair was damp around the edges, and the glow from the dashboard lights reflected across worried eyes. "Engine died," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once and walked around to the front of the car, lifting the hood as warm steam rose into the night air. The smell of overheated metal drifted upward. His hands moved with practiced ease, checking the battery connection, the belts, the ignition wiring. The storm rumbled softly over the fields while he worked, the only sounds the ticking engine and the whisper of rain against metal. Before we continue, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Ethan leaned deeper under the hood and adjusted a loose connector near the ignition coil. The engine coughed once when he signaled for the woman to try the key again. The powerful motor roared back to life, smooth and steady. He wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket and closed the hood carefully. The woman stepped out of the car then, rain glistening across the polished surface of the vehicle. Even in the dim roadside light, it was obvious this was not an ordinary car and not an ordinary driver. She looked at him with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan shrugged. "Just needed a small fix." As she reached into her purse, likely searching for cash, Ethan noticed something that made his chest tighten. Hanging from the car keys in her hand was a small silver charm shaped like a star. For a brief moment the sound of rain seemed to fade away, replaced by a memory from a small-town high school parking lot many years ago, when a teenage boy had handed that exact charm to the girl he believed he would love forever. Ethan stared at it, confusion rising slowly in his chest, because the face of the woman standing in front of him suddenly felt strangely familiar, like a memory waiting to be recognized. The woman watched the repaired engine run smoothly for a few seconds before she looked back at Ethan again, her expression thoughtful, as if she too sensed something strange in the air between them. Rain continued to fall softly along the empty highway while the headlights of passing trucks briefly illuminated the two figures standing beside the luxury car. "I really appreciate this," she said gently, still holding the keys in her hand. Ethan forced a polite smile and stepped back from the vehicle. It was nothing serious, just a loose connection. She hesitated for a moment, clearly preparing to offer him money, but Ethan raised a hand calmly. "Do not worry about it. Just make sure you get home safe." For a brief second the woman studied his face more closely, as if searching for a memory she could not quite reach. Something about the shape of his eyes or the quiet confidence in his voice felt familiar, yet distant. Finally she nodded with a grateful smile and slipped back into the driver's seat. The powerful engine purred steadily now. As the car slowly pulled back onto the highway, Ethan remained standing beside his old pickup truck, watching the red tail lights disappear into the curtain of rain. Only after the car vanished into the darkness did he exhale slowly and glance again at the empty road. The silver charm on her keys lingered in his mind like an unfinished sentence. He climbed into his truck and turned the ignition. The heater rattled to life, pushing warm air into the cold cabin as he drove away from the roadside. The long highway stretched ahead under a sky heavy with clouds, but Ethan barely noticed the road during the drive home. His mind kept drifting back to that small charm shaped like a star. Years earlier, when he was just a teenager with grease on his hands and dreams bigger than his small town, he had saved money for weeks to buy that charm from a tiny jewelry stand at the county fair. He remembered exactly how the girl had smiled when he gave it to her, standing beneath the bright lights of the Ferris wheel on a warm summer night. Ethan shook his head gently, almost laughing at himself. That had been a lifetime ago. People changed. Cities changed them. Life changed everything. By the time he turned off the highway and onto the quiet gravel road leading toward his small house outside town, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle. A faint porch light glowed in the distance, casting a warm circle onto the wooden steps. Ethan parked beside the house and turned off the truck engine. The silence of the countryside settled around him. Crickets hummed softly in the wet grass while the distant rumble of thunder faded across the open fields. When he stepped inside the house, the familiar smell of laundry soap and warm soup filled the air. A small lamp glowed on the kitchen counter, and a pair of tiny sneakers sat neatly beside the door. From the living room couch came the quiet sound of a child breathing in deep sleep. Ethan walked carefully into the room and smiled when he saw Sophie curled under a blanket, one arm wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. A half-finished drawing lay on the coffee table beside her colored pencils. The drawing showed a bright red car and a stick figure man holding a wrench, with the word Daddy written in large, uneven letters across the top. Ethan felt the weight of the long day settle gently onto his shoulders. He lifted the blanket to tuck it around her more securely, brushing a strand of hair away from her forehead. Sophie stirred slightly, but did not wake. Ethan lowered himself onto the edge of the couch for a moment, staring quietly at the drawing. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving the night calm and still. Yet somewhere across the city, a woman driving a luxury car was also thinking about the same strange encounter on that dark highway, and neither of them yet understood that the small act of kindness beside a broken engine had just reopened a chapter of their lives that had never truly closed. Across the city, the rain had already faded into a soft mist by the time the luxury car rolled through the tall iron gates of a glass tower rising above downtown Columbus. Security lights reflected across polished marble as the vehicle pulled into a reserved parking space beneath the building. The woman stepped out slowly, still holding the keys in her hand, as if the small silver charm attached to them had suddenly gained new weight. Charlotte Bennett stood quietly for a moment before walking toward the private elevator reserved for the executive floor. The lobby around her was silent except for the faint echo of her heels against the stone floor. Anyone watching would have seen a confident business leader returning from another long day. But Charlotte's mind was far away on that empty highway where a stranger with oil-stained hands had fixed her car without asking for anything in return. When the elevator doors opened onto the top floor, the quiet elegance of her office greeted her. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glowing skyline of the city. Awards lined the walls. Photographs of new vehicle models stood framed beside plaques celebrating the success of Bennett Motors, one of the fastest-growing automobile companies in the country. Charlotte set her keys on the desk, yet her hand lingered on them. The small silver charm caught the light of the office lamp. For a moment, she simply stared at it. Then slowly she lowered herself into the leather chair behind her desk. The memory returned with surprising clarity. A county fair in a small Ohio town many years ago. The scent of popcorn and summer air. A tall boy with grease on his hands laughing nervously as he handed her a tiny charm he had saved up to buy. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memory settle. Ethan Walker. The name had surfaced in her thoughts the instant she saw his face beneath the hood of the car. At first she had not trusted the feeling. Time had a way of reshaping people, sanding down the sharp edges of memory until everything felt distant and unreal. But the moment he spoke, something unmistakable had stirred in her chest. The calm tone, the quiet kindness, even the way he stepped back when she tried to offer payment. Charlotte reached forward and picked up the keys again. She turned the charm slowly between her fingers, studying the tiny silver shape. It was the same charm. She knew it without doubt now. Ethan had given it to her during the final summer before her family moved away from that small town. At the time she had believed their goodbye would only last a few months. But months had become years, and years had quietly turned into an entire lifetime. Charlotte stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city streets far below. Headlights flowed like streams of light between tall buildings, while distant sirens echoed through the night. Somewhere out there was the same man who had once believed they would build a future together. A man who now lived a life so different from her own that their worlds barely touched. Yet fate had brought them together again beside a broken engine on a lonely road. Charlotte returned to her desk and pressed a button on the office phone. A calm voice answered almost immediately. "Good evening, Miss Bennett. How can I assist you?" Charlotte hesitated for a moment before speaking, as if she was carefully choosing the direction of a road she had not walked in many years. "I need you to find someone for me," she said quietly. "His name is Ethan Walker." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Miss Bennett. Do you have any additional information?" Charlotte looked again at the charm in her hand before answering. "He owns a small repair garage outside the city." And she paused once more, her voice softening slightly. "He used to be my first love." As the call ended, Charlotte remained standing beside the window with the charm still in her hand. The city lights continued to glow beneath the dark sky, but now the future felt uncertain in a way she had not experienced in years. Because somewhere beyond those lights lived the man who had once known her before the boardrooms, before the titles, before the world had learned to call her chief executive officer. And deep down, Charlotte could not ignore the quiet question growing stronger in her heart. What would happen if the boy from her past suddenly walked back into her future? The next morning arrived quietly beneath a pale gray sky that stretched across the countryside like a soft blanket of mist. Ethan Walker woke before the sun fully rose, the way he always did. Years of early shifts at repair shops and construction garages had trained his body to greet the day long before the rest of the world stirred. The small kitchen clock showed 6 in the morning as he stood at the sink pouring fresh coffee into a chipped mug. Outside the window, dew clung to the tall grass around the yard, while a light breeze carried the distant sound of trucks traveling along the highway miles away. Ethan took a slow sip and glanced toward the living room, where Sophie still slept beneath her blanket. The quiet rhythm of her breathing filled the small house with a peaceful calm. For a moment he allowed himself to simply stand there, watching the early light stretch across the floorboards. But his thoughts drifted again to the woman on the highway. Charlotte Bennett. The name echoed in his mind now with certainty. He had not spoken it out loud in many years, yet the memory of her face had returned with surprising clarity. He remembered her laughter beside the old football field after school. He remembered the way she would sit on the hood of his first broken car while he tried to fix the engine. And he remembered the day her family moved away, leaving behind a silence that lasted longer than he ever expected. Ethan shook the thought away and set the coffee mug on the counter. Life had moved forward since then. It had to. He stepped quietly into the living room and gently tapped Sophie's shoulder. "Good morning, kiddo." Sophie stirred and blinked up at him with sleepy eyes before smiling. "Morning, Daddy." Within minutes the house filled with the ordinary sounds of a new day. The toaster clicked. The kettle hummed softly on the stove. Sophie sat at the small table coloring another picture while Ethan packed her lunch into a brown paper bag. The drawing she worked on now showed a blue car and a tall building beside it. "Is that another car from your imagination?" he asked with a small grin. Sophie nodded proudly. "When I grow up, I am going to design cars that never break down." Ethan laughed quietly. "If you figure out how to do that, you will make every mechanic in America very nervous." After breakfast, he drove Sophie to the small elementary school just outside town. The red brick building stood surrounded by maple trees whose leaves were beginning to turn golden with early autumn. Sophie waved goodbye before running toward the playground where other children gathered beneath the morning sun. Ethan waited until she disappeared inside the school doors before turning the truck back toward his garage. The small repair shop sat beside an old gas station on the edge of town. The sign above the garage door read Walker Auto Repair in fading blue letters that had not been repainted in years. Ethan rolled up the metal door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of motor oil and steel greeted him like an old friend. Tools lined the walls. An aging pickup truck waited on the lift in the center of the shop. It was a simple life. Hard work, long hours, and enough income to keep the lights on and food on the table. Yet even as Ethan began tightening bolts beneath the truck engine, the image of Charlotte standing beside that broken car returned again. Across the city at that exact moment, Charlotte Bennett stepped out of a black sedan in front of the Walker Auto Repair garage. She paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the faded sign above the door. The quiet hum of tools echoed from inside the building. Charlotte took a slow breath and walked toward the open garage, the silver charm still resting in her hand as she prepared to face the man who had once been the most important person in her life. The sound of a ratchet turning echoed through the small garage as Ethan tightened the final bolt beneath the pickup truck on the lift. Sunlight slipped through the dusty windows, casting long beams across the concrete floor and the rows of worn tools hanging on the walls. The quiet rhythm of work usually helped clear his mind, but today it did little to stop the memories that kept resurfacing. The image of Charlotte Bennett standing beside that broken car lingered in his thoughts like a photograph. He could not put away. Ethan slid out from beneath the truck and wiped his hands on a cloth rag. Just as he stood upright, the faint sound of footsteps reached the open garage door. At first he assumed it was another customer arriving early. Without looking up, he called out in a casual tone, "Morning. Give me just a second and I will be right with you." The footsteps stopped a few feet inside the garage. Ethan turned slowly and froze. Charlotte Bennett stood there in the soft morning light, the same calm expression on her face that he remembered from the night before. She wore a simple navy coat and dark trousers that somehow looked both elegant and effortless, yet it was not her clothing that caught his attention. It was the familiarity in her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them seemed to hold years of unspoken questions. Finally, Charlotte gave a small, nervous smile. "Hello, Ethan." Hearing his name in her voice felt like a door opening somewhere deep in his memory. Ethan blinked once, almost as if confirming that the moment was real. "Charlotte." The word left his mouth slowly, filled with disbelief. "You are the last person I expected to see standing in this garage." Charlotte took a few careful steps forward, glancing around at the shop with quiet curiosity. "It looks exactly how I imagined it would." Ethan folded his arms loosely, unsure whether to laugh or shake his head. "You imagined it." Charlotte nodded gently. "I asked someone to help me find you after last night." Ethan studied her face, noticing the same small dimple that used to appear when she smiled during their teenage years. Back then, neither of them had imagined the paths their lives would take. "What are you doing here, Charlotte?" She lifted the keys in her hand, the small silver charm catching the sunlight as it swayed slightly. "I wanted to thank you properly for helping me last night." Ethan glanced at the charm and felt the familiar rush of memories once again. "You kept it all these years." Charlotte looked down at the charm as if she had nearly forgotten it was there. "Of course I did. You gave it to me the night of the county fair." Ethan let out a quiet breath, the confirmation settling the last of his doubts. "I thought maybe I imagined that." Charlotte shook her head softly. "You did not imagine it, Ethan. I never forgot." The silence returned for a moment, but this time it carried a warmer feeling. Ethan gestured toward an old wooden stool near the workbench. "You can sit if you want." Charlotte sat carefully while Ethan leaned against the workbench across from her. For the first time since she arrived, Charlotte looked directly into his eyes without hesitation. "You disappeared after my family moved away." Ethan gave a small shrug. "I stayed in the same town. Someone had to keep fixing the cars around here." Charlotte laughed quietly, the sound both familiar and unexpected. "And now you are still doing exactly that." Ethan nodded. "Turns out I am pretty good at it." Charlotte watched him carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Ethan, I did not come here only to say thank you." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Then why did you come?" Charlotte took a slow breath before answering. "Because after last night, I realized something important. And Ethan, I think the two of us might have more unfinished history than either of us ever realized." Charlotte's words lingered in the quiet garage long after she finished speaking. Ethan leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms slowly as he studied her face. The sunlight streaming through the dusty windows illuminated the small space between them, and for a moment the years that had passed seemed to blur together. "Unfinished history," he repeated quietly, as if testing the idea. Charlotte nodded. "Yes, I think there are things neither of us ever really said." Ethan let out a small breath and looked down at the concrete floor before meeting her eyes again. "Charlotte, the last time I saw you we were standing in the parking lot behind Lincoln High School. Your father's car was already packed, and you told me you would write when you got settled in the city." Charlotte's expression softened with a mixture of regret and nostalgia. "I remember that day very clearly." Ethan gave a faint smile that did not quite hide the sadness behind it. "I waited for those letters for a long time." Charlotte lowered her gaze for a moment. "I wrote the first one, you know. I never sent it." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Why not?" Charlotte took a slow breath as if the memory still carried weight. "My father had already decided that our lives were going to be very different after we moved. He believed I needed to focus on school and eventually on the company. Everything became about responsibility and expectations. Ethan nodded slowly. Sounds about right for someone who ends up running a huge automobile company. Charlotte gave a quiet laugh. It did not feel huge when it started. It was just a lot of long nights and impossible decisions. She paused before adding gently, but I thought about you more times than you would probably believe. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how to respond. Well, I guess life had other plans for both of us. Charlotte's eyes drifted around the garage again, taking in the workbenches, the engine parts, the smell of motor oil hanging in the air. And what about you? She asked softly. Did you always plan to stay here and run this garage? Ethan shook his head slightly. Not exactly. When we were teenagers, I used to think I would become an automotive engineer. I even applied to a technical college in Dayton. Charlotte looked surprised. You never told me that. Ethan shrugged lightly. I guess I figured talking about dreams does not make them happen any faster. Charlotte tilted her head. What changed? Ethan was quiet for a moment before answering. Life. My father passed away during my last year of school. Someone had to keep the family house and the old repair shop going. One year turned into another. Then Sophie came along, and suddenly my plans did not matter as much as hers. Charlotte's expression softened again. Your daughter. Ethan nodded with a small smile. She is 8 years old and already thinks she is going to design the fastest cars in the world someday. Charlotte smiled warmly at that. She sounds remarkable. Ethan laughed quietly. She is. The garage fell silent again for a moment. But this time the quiet carried something gentler. Charlotte stood from the stool and took a few slow steps toward the open garage door. Outside, the small town street moved at its usual relaxed pace. A delivery truck passed by. Somewhere a dog barked in the distance. Charlotte turned back toward Ethan. Our lives went in completely different directions, she said thoughtfully. But somehow we still ended up meeting again beside that broken engine. Last night, Ethan followed her gaze toward the street. Funny how things work out sometimes. Charlotte studied him carefully before speaking again. Ethan, what if that moment was not just coincidence? Ethan raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Charlotte folded her hands together thoughtfully. I mean, what if it was a second chance for both of us to see where those unfinished paths might lead? The quiet words Charlotte had spoken lingered in the warm air of the garage like the fading echo of a distant bell. Ethan remained standing beside the workbench, his arms loosely folded while he watched her. A second chance. The idea sounded simple when spoken aloud, yet something about it stirred a mixture of curiosity and caution deep inside him. Outside the garage door, the small town street continued its slow afternoon rhythm. A pickup truck rolled past the gas station across the road while the wind gently rustled the leaves of the tall maple tree near the sidewalk. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but thoughtful. Charlotte, people do not usually get second chances at the lives they left behind. Charlotte met his gaze without hesitation. Maybe not. But sometimes life gives us the chance to create something new instead. Ethan gave a quiet half-smile. You always did know how to turn a complicated idea into something that sounded hopeful. Charlotte took a few steps closer to the workbench. Ethan, I am not here to reopen old memories just for the sake of nostalgia. I came because I believe there might be something important we could do together. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. Together. Charlotte nodded. You fixed my car in less than 5 minutes last night. You did it in the rain with tools that look like they have been in this shop for 20 years. That tells me something about your ability. Ethan shrugged lightly. I have been fixing engines since I was 14 years old. Turns out practice helps. Charlotte smiled faintly. At Bennett Motors we employ some of the most experienced automotive engineers in the country. Yet last month we had a prototype vehicle that stalled during testing because no one noticed a mechanical flaw that a mechanic with real-world experience might have caught immediately. Ethan listened quietly, unsure where the conversation was leading. Charlotte continued, her tone steady and sincere. My company builds advanced vehicles, but sometimes the people designing them forget what it means to work with machines outside of laboratories and computer simulations. We need someone who understands engines the way you do. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Charlotte, you run one of the largest automobile companies in the country. What exactly are you suggesting? Charlotte took a slow breath before answering. I want you to come work with us. Ethan blinked once in surprise. Work with you? Charlotte nodded. I want you to join Bennett Motors as a mechanical advisor. Someone who can look at our designs and tell us the truth about how they will perform in the real world. The garage fell silent again. Ethan stared at her as if trying to measure the distance between his simple repair shop and the glass towers where Charlotte spent most of her days. After a moment, he let out a quiet laugh. "Charlotte, I appreciate the offer, but I think you might be forgetting something." Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "What is that?" Ethan gestured around the garage. "This is my world. Oil stains, broken trucks, and customers who pay me in cash or homemade pie when they cannot afford a full repair bill. I do not exactly fit into corporate boardrooms." Charlotte stepped closer, her expression firm yet warm. "Ethan, the reason I came here is because you do not fit into that world. You understand machines in a way that many engineers never will. That perspective is exactly what we need." Ethan rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. "And what about this place?" "This shop keeps the lights on for my house and food on the table for my daughter." Charlotte answered without hesitation. "Bennett Motors can offer you a salary that would allow you to keep this shop open if you want to, or expand it, or build something even better." Ethan studied her face carefully. Charlotte Bennett had always been determined, even as a teenager. When she believed in something, she pursued it without hesitation. Yet this offer felt almost unreal. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "Charlotte, I cannot accept something like that. Not just because of money or pride. My life is here. My daughter's school is here. Everything she knows is here." Charlotte listened quietly, then nodded with understanding. "I expected you might say that." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You did." Charlotte smiled gently. "That is why I am not asking you to decide today." She walked toward the garage door and paused in the sunlight before turning back toward him. "Ethan, sometimes the road we believe is fixed in place turns out to have more directions than we ever imagined. Think about it. Because whether you accept my offer or not, I have a feeling that our lives have already started moving toward a future neither of us expected." Charlotte Carr disappeared down the quiet street, leaving Ethan standing in the open doorway of the garage with the afternoon sun warming the concrete floor around him. For several minutes he remained there without moving, replaying her words again and again in his mind. A mechanical advisor at Bennett Motors. The idea felt as distant and unlikely as a different lifetime. Finally, he turned back toward the half-repaired pickup truck on the lift and forced himself to return to work. Engines made sense to him. Bolts either fit or they did not. Machines either ran or they broke down. Life, on the other hand, had a way of presenting choices that could not be fixed with a wrench. While Ethan worked beneath the truck, unaware of the ripple Charlotte visit had already created, several miles away inside the glass headquarters of Bennett Motors, the atmosphere was very different. The executive conference room overlooked the city skyline, its wide windows reflecting rows of polished tables and sleek leather chairs. At the head of the table sat Marcus Bennett, the chief financial officer of the company and Charlotte's older cousin. Marcus was a tall man with sharp features and a reputation for controlling every detail of the company financial strategy. A tablet rested in front of him as he studied a series of reports while several executives quietly waited for the meeting to begin. Marcus finally looked up and tapped the screen with a finger. The name Ethan Walker appeared across the display along with a simple photograph taken from a public license record. One of the younger managers leaned forward slightly. "Who is that?" Marcus' voice remained calm, but carried a trace of suspicion. "That is the mechanic our chief executive officer spent her morning visiting." The room grew noticeably quieter. Another executive frowned slightly. "A mechanic?" Marcus nodded. "According to the report, he owns a small repair garage outside Columbus and has lived in the same county most of his life." The younger manager looked confused. Why would Charlotte Bennett personally visit someone like that? Marcus leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "That is exactly what I intend to understand." He turned the tablet toward the group. "Charlotte is planning to bring this man into the company as a mechanical advisor." Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. One woman cleared her throat carefully. "With respect, Marcus, our engineering division already has over 100 specialists with advanced degrees." Marcus' expression hardened slightly. "Precisely. Which raises the question of why our chief executive officer believes a small-town mechanic is suddenly qualified to advise a corporation that produces millions of vehicles each year." Another executive spoke cautiously. "Perhaps she simply respects his practical experience." Marcus' eyes narrowed slightly. Or perhaps there is another reason. He tapped the photograph again and leaned forward. "I want a full background report on Ethan Walker. His finances, his personal connections, everything." The room remained silent for a moment before one of the assistants nodded. "We can have that information by tomorrow morning." Marcus allowed a thin smile to appear. "Good. Because if someone intends to enter this company through a personal connection to the chief executive officer, I want to know exactly what their intentions are." Across town, Ethan finished tightening the final bolt beneath the pickup truck and lowered the lift with a soft mechanical hum. The engine started smoothly when he turned the key, and the familiar satisfaction of a completed repair brought a brief smile to his face. Yet even as he closed the hood, he could not ignore the feeling that something larger had begun to move beyond the walls of his small garage. What Ethan did not know was that Charlotte offer had already drawn the attention of people whose influence reached far beyond his quiet town, and the road ahead was about to become far more complicated than a broken engine on a rainy night. The next morning the town woke beneath a clear blue sky, the kind that made the air feel lighter and the roads look brighter than the day before. Ethan Walker unlocked the garage door of Walker Auto Repair just after sunrise, rolling the metal door upward as the familiar scent of engine oil and steel greeted him again. The quiet routine of another workday should have felt normal, yet something inside him remained unsettled. Charlotte Bennett's visit the day before had stirred memories he had buried for many years, and her unexpected offer still echoed in his mind like an unfinished conversation. Ethan pushed those thoughts aside as he began organizing tools along the workbench. Work always helped clear his head. Within an hour, the first customer arrived with an aging sedan that rattled loudly whenever the engine turned over. Ethan lifted the hood and began examining the problem while the radio on the shelf played a soft country song in the background. Everything felt ordinary again, and for a moment Ethan almost convinced himself that Charlotte's visit had simply been a strange interruption in his usual life. Then the black sedan arrived. The vehicle rolled slowly into the gravel lot outside the garage and stopped near the entrance. Ethan barely noticed at first, assuming it was another customer, but when two men stepped out of the car his attention shifted immediately. They were dressed in dark suits that looked sharply out of place beside the dusty repair shop. One of them held a thin folder, while the other glanced around the garage, as if studying every detail of the building. Ethan wiped his hands on a cloth and walked toward them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The taller man gave a polite nod. "Mr. Ethan Walker." Ethan hesitated slightly before answering. "Yes, that is me." The man opened the folder and studied the document inside for a moment before speaking again. "My name is Daniel Brooks, and this is my associate. We represent the financial division of Bennett Motors." Ethan felt a quiet tension settle in his chest. "Charlotte Company. That was fast." Daniel Brooks continued in a professional tone. "We are conducting a routine background verification connected to a potential advisory position that the chief executive officer is considering." Ethan crossed his arms slowly. "I did not realize I was being investigated." Daniel Brooks smiled politely, but did not appear embarrassed. "It is standard procedure when someone is considered for a position that may influence company operations." Ethan nodded once, though the situation felt uncomfortable. "What exactly do you need?" Daniel Brooks flipped to another page in the folder. "We simply want to confirm several details about your business and financial history." Ethan watched the two men carefully as they walked through the garage, occasionally making notes. The second man examined the equipment in the shop and even glanced at the old service records stacked on a nearby shelf. After several minutes, Daniel Brooks returned to stand in front of Ethan again. "Mr. Walker, according to our records, your repair shop has operated for more than 12 years and has maintained a consistent reputation for honest service." Ethan shrugged lightly. "That is how a small-town business survives." Daniel Brooks nodded as he closed the folder. "There is only one detail that concerns our office." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What detail is that?" Daniel Brooks' voice lowered slightly. 3 years ago, your shop nearly closed due to outstanding property taxes and repair loans." Ethan felt a flicker of irritation. "I managed to resolve those debts." Daniel Brooks gave another calm nod. "Yes, you did. But some members of our executive board may view that financial history as a potential risk." Ethan looked directly at the man. "Are you suggesting I cannot do honest work because I struggled to keep my business alive?" Daniel Brooks held up a hand in a reassuring gesture. "I am not making that judgment. I am simply explaining that certain executives may question your sudden connection to the chief executive officer." Ethan stared at the black sedan parked outside the garage. A few days earlier his world had been limited to repairing engines and picking up his daughter from school. Now strangers in expensive suits were examining his past, as if his life were part of a corporate report. Daniel Brooks closed the folder completely. Thank you for your time, Mr. Walker. Our report will be delivered to the executive board this evening. As the two men walked back toward their car, Ethan remained standing in the doorway of the garage, watching them leave. The quiet gravel lot felt strangely different now, as if invisible eyes had begun to follow his every move. And somewhere in the tall glass tower across the city, decisions were already being made that could change the direction of his life forever. The black sedan disappeared down the road, leaving a thin cloud of dust drifting across the gravel lot. But the uneasy feeling it left behind stayed with Ethan long after the engine noise faded. For the rest of the afternoon, he worked through a line of small repairs, replacing brake pads on an old truck, adjusting a timing belt on a compact car, and helping an elderly farmer whose tractor refused to start. Normally, the steady rhythm of honest work cleared his mind. Yet today, every turn of a wrench reminded him that somewhere across the city his name was now being discussed inside conference rooms filled with executives who had never stepped inside a place like Walker Auto Repair. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a warm shade of gold, and Ethan closed the garage door for the day. He climbed into his pickup truck and drove toward the elementary school just outside town where Sophie waited every afternoon. Children ran across the playground as parents gathered along the sidewalk, and when Sophie spotted his truck, she ran toward it with a bright smile that instantly lifted the tension from his shoulders. She climbed into the passenger seat, holding another drawing covered in bright colored shapes. "Daddy, look," she said proudly. "This one is a car that runs on sunshine." Ethan laughed softly as he studied the picture. "If that ever becomes real, the whole world will want to hire you as an engineer." Sophie grinned and buckled her seat belt while Ethan started the engine. The drive home took them past fields stretching wide beneath the setting sun. For a few quiet minutes, Ethan listened to Sophie describe her day at school, but the conversation was interrupted when his phone vibrated on the dashboard. He glanced at the screen and felt a small jolt of surprise. Charlotte Bennett's name appeared across the display. Ethan hesitated before answering. "Hello, Charlotte." Her voice carried the calm confidence he remembered from their younger years, yet there was urgency beneath it. "Ethan, I just heard that members of the financial division visited your garage today." Ethan looked out at the long road ahead. "Yes, they did. I guess word travels quickly inside a big company." Charlotte exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "Marcus Bennett ordered that investigation without informing me first." Ethan frowned slightly. "Marcus Bennett, my cousin and the chief financial officer of the company," Charlotte explained. "He believes anyone outside our corporate structure should be treated as a potential threat." Ethan glanced toward Sophie, who was quietly watching the passing scenery. "Well, I suppose from his point of view, a small-town mechanic suddenly connected to the chief executive officer might look suspicious." Charlotte's voice softened slightly. "Ethan, I want you to know something clearly. Whatever report Marcus prepares will not change my decision." Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Charlotte, you do not have to fight your own board for my sake." Charlotte replied without hesitation. "This is not about fighting anyone. It is about recognizing talent when I see it and making decisions that move the company forward." Ethan was silent for a moment before speaking again. "What if your board refuses to accept that decision?" Charlotte answered calmly. "Then they will learn that I did not build Bennett Motors by letting other people decide what is possible." The conviction in her voice reminded Ethan of the determined girl he had once known beside the county fair lights. As the truck rolled into his driveway, Charlotte spoke again, more gently. "Ethan, I will be presenting your advisory position to the executive board tomorrow morning. There may be resistance, but I want you to be prepared." Ethan looked out across the quiet fields surrounding his small home. "Prepared for what?" Charlotte paused before answering. "Prepared for the possibility that your life is about to change far more than either of us expected." The next morning dawned bright and clear across the city as sunlight reflected from the glass walls of the Bennett Motors headquarters. Inside the executive boardroom, the long polished table was already filled with senior members of the company leadership. Papers and digital reports lay neatly arranged before each chair. The atmosphere carried the quiet tension of a meeting where important decisions were about to be made. Charlotte Bennett stood near the tall windows overlooking the skyline, calm and composed as she reviewed a tablet in her hands. When the final board member entered the room, Marcus Bennett cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly. The meeting of the executive board will now begin. Charlotte turned from the window and took her seat at the head of the table. Her presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. She had built the company through years of relentless determination, and even those who disagreed with her rarely underestimated her authority. Marcus tapped the screen of his tablet, and the photograph of Ethan Walker appeared on the large display at the front of the room. As many of you know, Marcus began in a controlled voice. Our chief executive officer has proposed the creation of a new mechanical advisory role within the company. This role is intended for the individual currently displayed on the screen. Several executives studied the image of the small-town mechanic standing beside the faded sign of Walker Auto Repair. One board member adjusted his glasses before speaking. With respect, Charlotte, our engineering division already contains hundreds of trained specialists. What advantage does this individual provide that our existing team cannot offer? Charlotte folded her hands calmly on the table. Real-world mechanical insight. The room remained quiet as she continued. Our engineers design extraordinary vehicles, but they often work inside laboratories and digital simulations. Ethan Walker has spent his entire life working with engines under real conditions. His experience represents knowledge that cannot be learned from textbooks or computer models. Marcus leaned back in his chair with a measured expression. Or perhaps his experience represents a liability. Charlotte looked directly at him. Explain your concern, Marcus. Marcus gestured toward the screen where financial information appeared beside Ethan's photograph. 3 years ago, Mr. Walker nearly lost his repair shop due to unpaid property taxes and business loans. While he eventually resolved those debts, this financial history raises serious questions about whether he should influence decisions within a corporation responsible for billions of dollars in production each year. Several board members nodded thoughtfully. Charlotte listened without interruption before answering. Marcus, you are describing a man who struggled to keep a small business alive after losing his father and raising his daughter alone. That situation does not demonstrate weakness. It demonstrates resilience. Marcus' voice sharpened slightly. It also demonstrates risk. Charlotte's eyes remained steady. The greater risk is surrounding ourselves only with people who think the same way. Innovation comes from understanding problems from every possible angle. A mechanic who has repaired thousands of engines in the real world may notice flaws our engineers overlook. The boardroom fell silent for a moment as the members considered her words. Finally, an older executive spoke carefully. Charlotte, are you confident this decision is based purely on professional judgment? Charlotte understood the deeper meaning behind the question. She answered without hesitation. Yes. Ethan Walker earned my respect through his skill and integrity long before this meeting ever took place. Marcus studied her expression for several seconds before speaking again. And if the board refuses this proposal? Charlotte leaned forward. Slightly, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. Then the board will need to explain why it is afraid to listen to someone whose experience comes from the real world instead of a conference room. Across town, Ethan Walker finished closing the garage for the morning and stepped outside into the sunlight. He had no idea that his future was currently being debated inside a boardroom miles away. All he knew was that Charlotte had asked him to prepare for change. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the quiet sense that the life he had carefully built around routine and responsibility was standing on the edge of something entirely new. The executive boardroom remained silent for several long moments after Charlotte Bennett finished speaking. The members seated around the polished table exchanged careful glances, weighing the implications of her proposal. Sunlight streamed through the towering glass windows behind her, illuminating the city skyline that had become a symbol of the company's success. Finally, the chairman of the board, an older man named Richard Alden who had served the company since its earliest days, cleared his throat and folded his hands on the table. Charlotte, your leadership has transformed Bennett Motors from a small regional manufacturer into one of the most respected automotive companies in the country. Your judgment has earned this board trust over many years. However, the concerns raised today cannot be dismissed lightly. Marcus Bennett leaned slightly forward, watching the exchange with a patient expression that barely concealed his skepticism. Richard Alden continued. We must consider not only the potential advantages of bringing Mr. Walker into the company, but also the precedent such a decision may establish. Charlotte listened carefully before answering. I understand the responsibility that comes with every decision made in this room. But I also believe that the strength of this company lies in our willingness to recognize talent wherever it exists. Ethan Walker may not hold an engineering degree, yet he possesses decades of mechanical insight that cannot be replicated by computer simulations. Marcus responded immediately. Insight is valuable, but corporate governance demands accountability. The moment we place someone in a position of influence within this organization, we must ensure that their background reflects stability and sound judgment. Charlotte met his gaze calmly. Ethan Walker built his business through persistence and integrity. The financial challenges mentioned earlier were not the result of poor judgment, but the reality of operating a small business while raising a child alone. Richard Alden raised a hand gently to quiet the discussion. There is another factor we must consider. The board must ensure that this proposal is evaluated objectively, free from any personal connections that might influence our decision. Several members shifted slightly in their seats. Charlotte knew exactly what the chairman was suggesting. Her voice remained steady as she answered. If you are referring to the fact that Ethan Walker and I knew each other many years ago, then yes, that is true. But my recommendation today is based on professional evaluation, not personal sentiment. Marcus studied her carefully. Yet personal history often clouds judgment. Charlotte leaned forward slightly. Or sometimes it simply allows us to recognize character more clearly than a written report ever could. The room fell silent again as the board members considered her words. Richard Alden finally spoke once more. Very well. The board will take a brief recess to review the information provided. Afterward, we will cast a formal vote on whether to authorize the advisory position and extend the offer to Mr. Walker. Chairs shifted softly as the executives rose from the table. Some moved toward the windows while others gathered in small groups, discussing the proposal in quiet voices. Marcus remained seated for a moment longer before standing beside Charlotte. You are very confident about this mechanic from your past, he said calmly. Charlotte turned to face him. I am confident about his ability. Marcus folded his arms. Confidence can sometimes become a liability when business and personal history begin to intersect. Charlotte answered without hesitation. The real liability would be ignoring someone capable of helping this company build better vehicles simply because he did not come from the same corporate background as the rest of us. Marcus studied her for a moment before giving a faint nod. We will see what the board decides. Across the city, Ethan Walker stood beside his open garage door watching the afternoon sunlight stretch across the quiet street. He had just finished repairing the transmission on a delivery truck and was wiping his hands clean when his phone vibrated in his pocket. The screen displayed Charlotte Bennett's name once again. Ethan took a breath before answering. Hello, Charlotte. Her voice carried a quiet determination. Ethan, the board meeting is still in progress. But I want you to know something before the vote takes place. Ethan leaned against the workbench as he listened. What is that? Charlotte spoke gently but firmly. No matter how this decision ends today, meeting you again has reminded me of something important. Ethan asked quietly. What did it remind you of? Charlotte paused briefly before answering. That sometimes the most meaningful roads in life begin with something as simple as stopping to help someone beside a broken car. The afternoon sun hung low over the quiet town when Ethan Walker finished sweeping the floor of his garage and closed the metal toolbox beside the workbench. The day had passed slowly, each hour carrying the quiet weight of uncertainty. Somewhere in the city, a boardroom full of executives was deciding whether his life would remain exactly as it had always been or move towards something completely different. Ethan tried not to think about it, but the thought returned again and again like the steady ticking of a cooling engine. Just as he was about to close the garage door for the evening, his phone rang once more. The name on the screen was Charlotte Bennett. Ethan answered calmly. Hello, Charlotte. For a moment, there was only the soft sound of distant voices on the other end of the call. Then Charlotte spoke. Ethan, the vote just finished. Ethan leaned against the doorframe of the garage, his eyes drifting toward the quiet street. And what did they decide? Charlotte's voice carried a quiet note of satisfaction. The board approved the position. Ethan blinked slowly, absorbing the words. They did. Charlotte continued. It was not unanimous. Marcus argued against it until the final moment. But the chairman supported the proposal, and the majority agreed that your experience could bring something valuable to the company. Ethan exhaled quietly, surprised by the mixture of relief and uncertainty rising inside him. That is a big decision for a man who spends most of his days fixing pickup trucks and tractors. Charlotte laughed softly. That is exactly why it matters. For the first time in many years, our engineers will hear the perspective of someone who understands how these machines behave outside perfect laboratory conditions. Ethan looked around the small garage that had been his entire professional world for more than a decade. The worn concrete floor, the tools hanging along the walls, the faded sign outside that. Reed Walker Auto Repair. Charlotte continued, speaking gently. Ethan, the advisory role will allow you to work with our design teams several days each month. The rest of your time can remain here if you wish. I promised you this opportunity would not take you away from your daughter or the life you built. Ethan nodded, even though she could not see the gesture. Thank you, Charlotte. That means more than you know. Charlotte's voice softened. Ethan, I did not fight for this position only because of your skill. I did it because I trust the person you have become. Ethan felt the quiet truth in her words. Sometimes life brings people back together for reasons we do not understand at first, he said thoughtfully. Charlotte replied with warmth. Perhaps that broken engine on the highway was simply life reminding us that some paths are meant to cross again. Ethan smiled faintly as he looked toward the road beyond the garage. I suppose that means I should start preparing for my first day advising one of the largest automobile companies in the country. Charlotte answered with a hint of humor. Do not worry. You will still be the same mechanic who fixed my car in the rain. The only difference is that now an entire company will be listening when you explain how to make an engine run better. Later that evening, Ethan drove home to the small house at the edge of town. Sophie sat at the kitchen table finishing a drawing when he walked in. She held up the paper proudly. Daddy, look. It is a car you helped design. Ethan studied the colorful picture of a bright new vehicle with a large sun above it. He smiled and placed the drawing on the refrigerator door. Maybe someday that idea will become real, he said. Sophie grinned. I know it will. As the quiet evening settled around their home, Ethan stepped onto the porch and looked out across the darkening fields. The road that had once felt small and predictable now stretched forward with possibilities he had never imagined. And it had all begun on a rainy night when a mechanic stopped to help a stranger beside a broken car, not knowing that the woman behind the wheel had once been the first person he ever loved.